You're always tired. Not the tiredness that sleep resolves, but something deeper, something that precedes your day and outlasts your night. You look at your phone and see that others are already awake, already posting, already performing their morning routines with the precision of corporate executives managing productivity portfolios. Your first thought isn't about yourself. It's about falling behind. But here's what the system needs you to never understand. Everyone is tired. The person posting their morning workout is tired. The colleague who responds to emails at midnight is tired. The friend who seems to effortlessly balance 3 projects is tired. We've entered an era where exhaustion isn't an individual condition, but a collective state, yet we experience it in perfect isolation. This is the architecture of achievement society. It doesn't burn you out through explicit demands. It burns you out through the perpetual presence of an invisible standard, one that updates itself faster than you can meet it. You're not competing against your coworkers anymore. You're competing against an algorithmic composite of everyone's highlight reels, an impossible amalgamation that exists nowhere except in your perception of inadequacy. Previous generations understood pressure as something external. The factory boss demanding more output. The institution requiring compliance. There was a clear enemy, and therefore the possibility of collective resistance. But contemporary pressure operates through a different mechanism. It doesn't come from outside. It emerges from within, dressed in the language of self-care, personal growth, optimization. You're not being exploited. You're fulfilling your potential. You're not exhausted. You're on a journey. This is the brilliance of the system's evolution. It discovered that the most efficient form of control is self-control. It transformed the worker into the entrepreneur of their own life, and in doing so, eliminated the distinction between labor and existence. You don't clock out anymore. You carry the office in your nervous system. When everyone around you performs this same endless self-optimization, pressure stops being an imposition and becomes atmosphere. You breathe it. It shapes your sense of what's normal, what's expected, what counts as a worthwhile life. There's a reason burnout has become epidemic precisely when we have more therapeutic language, more wellness apps, more resources for mental health than ever before. Because burnout isn't a mental health crisis. It's a political condition dressed in psychological language. The system teaches you to interpret your exhaustion as personal dysfunction. You lack resilience. You need better boundaries. You should try meditation, exercise, a new morning routine. But these solutions share a common feature. They place responsibility for a structural problem onto individual shoulders. What if your tiredness isn't a bug in your personal system? What if it's an accurate physiological response to something genuinely unsustainable? The person who recognizes this isn't weak. They're perceiving clearly. And that clarity, when it spreads, becomes dangerous to a system that requires your belief in individual inadequacy. Consider how you move through your day. Every interaction carries the weight of potential evaluation. The casual conversation with a colleague isn't just conversation. It's networking. The photograph you don't post represents missed opportunity. The evening you spend doing nothing becomes a small death in the ledger of productivity. This is what achievement society accomplishes. It transforms every moment into a site of potential optimization. There's no longer any distinction between who you are and what you produce. Your worth has become measurable, quantifiable, and most crucially, comparable. But comparison requires a standard, and the standard in our era is impossible by design. You're not competing against actual people anymore. You're competing against a composite image of everyone's carefully constructed highlights. The person who posts about their promotion isn't showing you their 3 failed interviews. The influencer documenting their perfect morning routine isn't including the medication that makes it possible. You're measuring your complete, unedited reality against everyone else's performance of success. And here's where the exhaustion multiplies. Because you know, at some level, that you're also performing. You're also editing. You're also presenting a version of yourself that doesn't quite match the internal experience, which means you can never trust that anyone else's apparent ease is real. The system has made authenticity indistinguishable from strategy and strategy indistinguishable from survival. They tell you to think positive, to focus on gratitude, to reframe your challenges as opportunities. This isn't wellness advice. It's a mechanism of control that operates through the language of care. Because what this positivity actually demands is that you interpret your accurate perception of systemic dysfunction as personal pathology. You're not responding appropriately to an inappropriate situation. You're failing to maintain the correct attitude. The person who feels exhausted in a genuinely exhausting situation isn't sick. They're perceiving clearly. The person who feels anxious in a precarious world isn't disordered. They're reading the room accurately. But the system cannot allow this interpretation because it would require acknowledging that the problem isn't in your head. It's in the structure. So instead, they offer you solutions that maintain the structure while adjusting you to fit it better. Better time management, more resilience training, enhanced coping strategies. These aren't designed to reduce your burden. They're designed to increase your capacity to carry it. There's a reason traditional forms of labor organizing have struggled in recent decades. It's not because workers have become less exploited. It's because exploitation has become invisible through the mechanism of apparent freedom. You're not being forced to check email at night. You're choosing to stay competitive. You're not being required to develop a personal brand. You're investing in your future. You're not being exploited by an external boss. You're simply being an entrepreneur of yourself. And entrepreneurs don't have exploiters. They have opportunities. This transformation is capitalism's greatest achievement. It convinced you that your self-exploitation is self-care, that your exhaustion is your fault, that your burnout is a personal failure rather than a collective condition. They've turned your exhaustion into content. Burnout listicles, self-care Sunday posts, productivity systems designed to help you recover faster so you can produce more efficiently. Even your collapse has been monetized, transformed into another site of entrepreneurial opportunity. This is the insidious logic of achievement society. It doesn't deny that you're tired. It acknowledges your exhaustion and then sells it back to you as a problem requiring optimization. You don't need less work. You need better work-life balance. You don't need structural change. You need a more sophisticated personal system. But balance is a lie when both sides of the equation demand performance. Your work requires constant availability, perpetual growth, measurable output. And now your rest requires the same. You must rest efficiently. You must recover measurably. You must document your wellness journey, track your meditation minutes, quantify your self-care. There's no escape valve anymore because escape itself has become labor. The vacation you take must justify its existence through photographs. The hobby you pursue must demonstrate growth. The book you read should make you better, sharper, more competitive. Everything must serve the project of self-optimization, which means nothing ever stops being work. Here's what the system desperately needs you to misunderstand. Your exhaustion isn't evidence of your inadequacy. It's evidence that something is profoundly wrong with the conditions you're navigating. But they've trained you to read your body's accurate signals as personal failure. You feel depleted after a day of back-to-back video calls, after performing emotional availability for strangers online, after maintaining 3 different professional identities across various platforms. And instead of recognizing this as a reasonable response to unreasonable demands, you diagnose yourself as lacking resilience. This is how ideology works in achievement society. It doesn't announce itself as ideology. It presents itself as self-evident reality. Of course, you should respond to that email immediately. Of course, you should maintain an active social media presence. Of course, you should be developing side projects and personal brands and multiple revenue streams. These aren't political choices. They're just what everyone does. Except everyone doesn't want to do them. Everyone is exhausted by them. But because everyone performs compliance, the collective exhaustion remains invisible, experienced only in isolation. You think you're uniquely struggling with demands that everyone else handles effortlessly. You never see that everyone else is performing the same fiction of ease. There's a reason the system floods every silence with noise, every pause with content, every moment of potential reflection with distraction. Because in silence, you might hear something dangerous. You might hear yourself. You might recognize that the voice telling you you're not enough doesn't originate from you. It's been installed, carefully, systematically, through every advertisement that presented inadequacy and sold solution. Through every social media scroll that showed you what everyone else is apparently accomplishing. Through every productivity guru who promised that the right system would finally make you adequate. In that silence, you might recognize that you're not tired because you're deficient. You're tired because you're being asked to perform an impossible operation, to be simultaneously authentic and strategic, vulnerable and invincible, present and always available, resting and productive. The system has given you an equation that cannot be solved, and then diagnose your inability to solve it as personal failure. This is the core mechanism of achievement society. It creates conditions that guarantee exhaustion, and then sells you the exhaustion as evidence of your need for improvement. When you feel burned out, the first question isn't about your personal resilience. It's about what you're being asked to sustain. Because burnout isn't distributed randomly. It concentrates precisely where people are navigating contradictory demands that cannot simultaneously be met. The parent who must be endlessly available to both employer and child. The worker who must demonstrate passion for labor that doesn't provide security. The person who must maintain mental health while navigating systems designed to produce anxiety. These aren't personal challenges. They're structural impossibilities dressed in the language of individual responsibility. And this is where collective burnout reveals its political dimension. When exhaustion is universal but experienced in isolation, each person believes the problem originates in their personal inadequacy. But when that exhaustion is recognized as collective, as shared, as an accurate response to genuinely exhausting conditions, something shifts. The diagnosis moves from individual pathology to systemic critique. This is what achievement society cannot allow. Because if your burnout isn't about your personal failure, then the solution isn't individual optimization. It's collective refusal. There's a reason they've made rest feel guilty. Because rest that isn't productive, that doesn't serve future performance, that exists only for itself, represents something dangerous. It represents a life that hasn't been fully colonized by the logic of achievement. When you rest without justification, without tracking, without turning it into content or personal development, you're performing a small act of resistance. You're asserting that your existence has value independent of your output, that you don't need to earn your right to simply be. This sounds small, but in a system that requires your total availability, that demands you transform every aspect of existence into measurable performance, the assertion that some part of you remains unmeasurable becomes revolutionary. The people who recognize this aren't opting out of society. They're refusing to let society fully colonize their nervous systems. They're maintaining a territory that capitalism hasn't captured. And when enough people do this simultaneously, when exhaustion is recognized as collective rather than individual, the fiction that sustains the system begins to crack. Because the system doesn't fear your burnout. It's designed to produce it, to monetize it, to turn it into another market for wellness products and productivity systems. What it fears is the moment you recognize that your burnout is shared, that it's accurate, that it's pointing towards something that needs to change not in you, but in the structure that requires your exhaustion to function.